forgive me, for I have sinned. This right here is now officially my new preamp. Yes, it is diminutive in size, but it is large on capabilities. I'm going to tell you all about it. The new Schiit Syn. It's awesome.
Hello everyone, and welcome back. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to review this fascinating little device from Schiit, which they call the Syn. What is Syn? Well, that's going to take a bit of brush planing, so let's get started. Thank you to Schiit Audio for sending me this device for review. I was not paid, nor did I pay to receive this device on loan. First, I'll tell you what it is and why it's cool, but there's a lot to unpack there, and we'll get to it all. Then we'll take a look at the device and its features. I'll share my experiences with the device in 3 applications, including music, cinema, and gaming for both a 5.1 speaker rig and headphones. Lastly, I'll reach some conclusions and ultimately decide if I'm going to keep this little gem of a product. Let's begin. So what kind of surround processor is this? Well, the Syn only really attempts to carry out one function of a typical AVR or digital pre-pro, upmixing a stereo 2-channel signal into a multi-channel signal that will utilize a 5.1 speaker configuration rather than just a left and right speaker. So seems awesome, right? 6 speakers is more than 2. It must be better. Did you hear that? That's the sound of some audiophile 2-channel purist out there having a conniption, because it's not so simple as playing back all of the sound on all of the speakers. 2-channel stereo audio was specifically mixed to be played back on just 2 channels. The 5.1 surround tracks to your favorite movies, or perhaps a 5.1 mix of an album, were specifically mixed to be played back on 6 speakers. All of the speakers don't play the same sounds. What comes out of each speaker was specifically engineered to contribute just so to the overall sound picture that is generated. Now, you can convert between the two. If you have a 6-channel signal, you can downmix down to 2 channels. It's a fairly simple operation. Or you can upmix a 2-channel signal to 6 channels. Doing so, however, isn't so neat and tidy. You have to make certain assumptions about what the content of those channels should be. In other words, you have to make it up. And there are different ways of going about this, of course. You could simply take the left channel in a 2-channel signal and play it back on all of the left-hand channels, front left, side left, rear left, etc., and the right channel on all of the right-hand channels. Okay, perhaps combining the left and right channel together on the center channel. Well, there it is again. The 2-channel purist just went apoplectic. That will sound like really loud and everywhere-ish, I guess, but it will sound wrong. In order to understand why, we'll have to talk a little bit about how we hear. Since the 1960s, most audio tracks for movies, music, and games have been to some extent engineered to create a virtual spatial environment for you that corresponds to what you're seeing on the screen, or might hear coming from an arrangement of musicians. Audiophile folks will probably know this as soundstage. For a lot of people, this helps them break the immersion barrier and feel like they're in the movie, in the game, or at a performance. The way this works usually is 2 or more speakers in your head create a stereophonic or an integrative multi-channel sound field around you. The physical arrangement of the speakers, center channel in front of you, surround channels behind you, etc., replicate the spatial cues that help your brain construct its own 3-dimensional environment, which you experience as the world. So how is it that stuff behind you sounds like it's behind you? How come stuff on your left sounds like it's over there on your left, stuff that's in front of you, etc.? Well, our brain constructs a 3D 360-degree map with depth all around us with only 2 ears, your left and right. The trick is that your right ear hears what your left ear hears, and your left ear hears what your right ear hears, but, importantly, not in the same way. When there is a noise to your left, your right ear will hear it, but it won't sound exactly the same because your head's in the way and it shapes the sound. Your right ear is also a dozen centimeters or so further away from the noise, and the speed of sound is finite, measured in hundreds of kilometers per hour. Thus, your right ear will hear it just a split teeny tiny second after your left ear hears it. And your brain can then do the math, as it were. With the speed of sound effectively constant, your brain can take the differential and triangulate the precise direction from which the sound originated. This math is further refined by the shape of your head and the shape of your ears. Because of the asymmetricity of your ear, what's behind you sounds just a little bit different than what's in front of you. They are spectrally different. There is a spectral signature with which your brain is familiar of stuff behind you and stuff in front of you. Right? Altogether, your brain utilizes all of these spatial cues in order to correctly locate sounds in any direction, regardless of your orientation, and ultimately to create your subjective experience of space around you. So this is why upmixing a stereo signal to 6 channels requires a sound processor, and not simply like a channel repeater or a replicator. For the effect to work, you have to generate content. Now, AVRs and digital pre-pros can do this. The Dolby Pro Logic 2 or DTS Neo X technologies are common ways of doing this. These are proprietary digital domain approaches that will extract or generate a center channel by identifying the common sonic elements between the left and right channels. That is, what's panned hard center in the mix. This is typically correlated with the form of the content. Vocals and dialogue, mainly, for example, are typically panned hard center and are what would ordinarily be mapped to an actual center channel in a multi-channel mix. Similarly, it generates a subwoofer channel by digitally crossing over the bass on the L&R channels and redirecting it. These elements are then subtracted from the L&R channels, I think, depending on a selectable mode on the device, perhaps. Now, generating rear channels is a bit more tricky. There's simply no way for the machine to know what sort of content ought to be behind the viewer. It can, however, simulate effects of room reflections and atmospherics by creating time-delayed and frequency-shaped content that can dramatically enhance the subjective sense of immersion. Taken together, ProLogic and Neo X upmix a 2-channel signal to surround sound. Not surprisingly, Mike Moffat of Schiit Audio has some distinguished background in surround processors, and Jason Stoddard is a home theater buff himself. This, in a nutshell, is what the Syn does, but there are 2 key differences that make the Syn a really cool product. The first is that the Syn accomplishes this entirely in the analog domain. Do you know what that means? That means you can still use your fancy pants DAC. Hell, you can use a turntable. Yep, that's right. You can upmix your vinyl records to surround sound. All in analog with no analog to digital, digital to analog cycle, or messy digital signals processing. That means it's compatible with literally everything, at least on its analog inputs. DSD? Yeah. MQA? Certainly. HQ player? Of course. PGGB? PGGB. 2 Gs. PGGB. It's another upmixer like HQ player, but better. It works! A DJ controller, which, come to think about it, would be freaking awesome. Doesn't matter. It will take the analog stereo output of whatever you got. Hell, 1L. I plugged my kid's Toy Story time player into this. Pete the Cat in 5.1. Let me tell you, you have not heard Pete the Cat until you have heard it in 5.1. That's just my opinion. And it does this without the need for any kind of license or proprietary technology, so you're not paying for that either. Second, unlike the Dolby Pro Logic or DTS Neo modes on your AVR or Digital Pre-Pro, which are pretty much implemented as is with no simple way to customize it, the Syn has 4 tuning tiles right on the device. I guess technically you can always go into your AVR settings and change the levels of each channel manually, but it's a bit sloppy, blunt, and may not play well with your other content. The Syn, on the other hand, gives you 4 knobs that essentially give you the ability to optimize your surround sound mix right on the front of the device. And for me, this turned out to be very important. What I discovered was that there was really no ideal mix that is static across different forms of content. In fact, I found myself tuning these dials often, depending on what I was watching or listening to. In my view, this device is primarily a surround sound processor that is meant to be used with an actual physical 5.1 speaker setup. That being said, it also has some, in my opinion, secondary utility for headphones. First, it has a headphone output. It's not the most powerful headphone amp in the world, and I felt it struggled somewhat with my 300 ohm impedance HD800S. It did, however, sound decent with my easier to drive Focal Elysia. But what would a surround sound processor do for headphones that obviously only have two drivers? That's a very good question. As I mentioned earlier, we only have two ears through which all sounds we hear, wherever they come from, must be heard through. The reason why we perceive sounds as coming from any point around us is because our brain is sensitive to the subtle differentials between what each ear hears, as well as the contours of the ear, and does the math, so to speak. When something is making a noise on your left ear hears it first, then your right ear hears it again, maybe a half a millisecond later. Your brain triangulates the origin of the sound and locates the sound accurately and precisely within your field of perception. Mastering engineers can exploit this using a two-channel stereophonic speaker configuration, since both of your ears will hear both speakers. This is how they manage to create an apparently seamless field of sound in front of you, a soundstage, as it were, upon which an image is generated. This is why it seems like the singer is right in front of you, even though you only have speakers directly on your left and directly on your right. But this isn't possible with headphones, since your left ear only hears the left channel and your right ear only hears the right channel. Your brain still tries to do the math, but those important spatial cues are missing. This is why the soundstage, or the image that is generated, is really just kind of in your head, aligned basically between your ears, with the voice sort of coming from the center of your mushmelon. Any ASMR fans here? What? ASMR fans? Right. For my ASMR and binaural audio fans out there, you know that you absolutely can achieve a convincing 360-degree sound with just headphones. But you have to have a way of getting those spatial cues to your brain. ASMR artists embed those spatial cues in the two-channel recording itself, usually by using two microphones a dozen or so centimeters apart, like your head, one for the left channel and one for the right channel, which naturally pick up the same sounds but at slightly different times. They can even enhance the effect by using a so-called binaural microphone. That's a microphone that actually has little omnidirectional microphones embedded in little silicone ears that are shaped like human ears. The other way to do it is to generate them. There are a number of devices out there that will generate these spatial cues using digital signals processing with varying levels of complexity. It can be done in software using something like Redscape or Dolby Atmos for headphones, or can be done in hardware using a Creative Sound Blaster with Creative's Super XFi technology. The extraordinary Smith Realizer A16 is perhaps the ultimate. Now, the Syn also endeavors to some extent to do this. Now, the reason I classify its headphone functionality as secondary is because its approach to so-called headphone virtualization is the most simplistic in the above previously mentioned devices. The Smith Realizer will absolutely fool you into thinking you're in a room with dozens of speakers, but that's only because it's using extremely complex DSP. The other products I mentioned achieve less convincing results with a few assumptions about your head, ears, and the room, but it's still pretty sophisticated. The Syn, however, does this all in analog. There is no DSP, which is in one sense awesome, but it also means you have to use a much simpler approach. The Syn uses only two variables. When you plug headphones into the Syn, the speaker outputs cut out and the left side dials on the device, controlling the center and rear channels, are deactivated. The dials on the right, however, remain active. The with dial becomes functionally what is known as crossfeed. That is, the left and right channels are allowed to bleed into each other. That means that just like speakers IRL, the right ear is now hearing a bit of what the left ear hears and vice versa. Your brain will instantly pick up on this and begin to use that information to assemble your perception of the world. The result of the added crossfeed is to kind of bring the sound all kind of clustered to the center of your head. Unfortunately, there does not appear to be any tweaking of phase or delay added, which your brain would use to push the image forward out of your head onto a stage in front of you. So what the Syn can do, however, is introduce negative crossfeed. That is, to remove some of the content that is common on the left and right channels. This has the effect of pushing the image out from the center of your head to two clusters somewhere around your ear. In excess, this isn't a good thing because there is important content lost. But with a delicate touch, it's possible to increase the subjective sense of head stage while losing little. Further, I found that a bit of negative crossfeed combined with a presence adjustment reboosts some of that vocal content that is diminished. The combined result is something that's both wider in soundstage, but still emphasizes the center image voices. For this reason, I think when it comes to headphones, the Syn works substantially better with cinematic content than with music, but more on that later. Going from left to right, first we have a center extractor. This modulates the extent to which it extracts the common signal on the L and R channels, and then passes the sum off to a center channel. It's also impacted somewhat by boosts in presence frequencies, accentuating voices. Then you have the surround channels extractor. As far as I can tell, what this does is subtract right from left and left from right, and then does some frequency roll-off that emulates the natural acoustics of a large room. The result is a profoundly expanded sense of ambiance that I'd characterize as similar to some live music venues, when the sound is kind of everywhere but still mostly in front of you where the band is. Then you have a master volume in the middle. It's much larger than the others, so it's easy to find in the dark, thankfully. On the right side, you have width, which removes what's common between the left and right channels. What's remaining is going to be hard panned left and right and would sound awful on its own, but remember, you have the center channel picking up everything that's been removed. Lastly, you have a presence knob. This is a straightforward boost or cut to the so-called presence frequencies around 2 kHz, which for us humans is experienced as that sense of being there with another human voice. I guess you can think about it that way. You could think of this knob as bringing the main vocals closer to you or pushing them away. I don't know why it is, that's just what it feels like. I think its inputs are well conceived and are themselves instructive about what Schiit expects customers to do with the Syn, so I'll talk about those now. As you can see here, there are 3 inputs, 1 analog and 2 digital. It does contain its own DAC, so it's a DAC too. The analog input is a pair of RCAs for single-ended connectivity to your DAC, a turntable, a cassette deck, a reel-to-reel machine, a Tony's Storytime machine, an iPad, or whatever. Then you have a USB-C, which you would presumably use to connect to a PC or game console. Notably, it has a microphone input as well, which I guess is pretty cool. Accordingly, I'd say they expect gamers to benefit from a Syn. The second digital input, and this was an interesting choice, is an optical toslink. Why is this an interesting choice? Well, my fellow extreme audiophile nerds out there often have preferences in our digital inputs. And I think it's fair to say we generally agree that SPDIF over optical is the worst. When it comes to SPDIF, we like coaxial, which tends to have better jitter performance. Also, shout out to my I2S and AES elites out there. Much love. But, and this is a big but, optical is usually what TVs and game consoles have. Optical is generally more ubiquitous than coaxial, offering a wider range of compatible devices. Pretty much everything that does digital out does optical. So what I bet Schiit was thinking was, hey, optical is what your TV has or your game console. Thus, I expect Schiit thinks this device will be at the center of a home theater. The outputs are straightforward. You have a headphone output on the front and then your 6-channel outputs on the back. As I mentioned, having these dials turned out to be extremely important for me. I decided that there isn't really one set of settings that will work great for all of the different types of content I enjoy. Light touch adjustments, however, was typically all it took. The way I think of it is that you kind of get to be your own mixing engineer, tuning in the mix that works for you. Let me give you an example. I love Tom Petty. I can't even begin to tell you how much I love the recently released box set that contains a ton of live recordings from the time Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers did a 20-night stint as the house band at the Fillmore in San Francisco in like 1997 or something. It's an incredible collection, and there actually is an Atmos mix of it, though it's lossy and kind of 404 file not found everywhere except Tidal and Apple. I think you can get lossless in the collector's edition box set, but the larger issue, not the lossiness, is that, frankly, it's not a very good mix. It's kind of like a lot of the made-for-Tidal or made-for-Apple content that I would not be in the least bit surprised to learn was at least partially automated. Plus, you have to play it back through your AVR and not your fancy-pants stereo DAC. With the Syn, I can create my own mix and I can tune it just the way I like it. I actually feel like Tom's vocals are a bit recessed on my system. Dialing up the presence just a tad brings him up a bit closer to me. I can also dial up the ambience, the crowd noise, just like I want. I like a bit more than comes with the Atmos mix. And it's all going through my fancy pants DAC. Can a Syn be at the heart of your supreme ultimate music hall / home theater / gaming ring of doom? I tested the Syn with music, cinema, and games, with both a 5.1 speaker configuration and headphones. That's how I'll break it down. Music, cinema, and gaming, first in the speaker domain, and then with headphones, which is going to be a much shorter discussion. Alright, first let's talk about music. Let me say that I, for one, have come to love and appreciate multi-channel music. Much to my chagrin, it's never really caught up. And there are some real barriers to adoption. Crucially, most people don't have multi-channel systems for playback. And you audiophiles out there thinking a 2-channel system is expensive, wait until you add 4 more speakers and amplification into the mix. But why should someone invest in a multi-channel system when, problem 2, like 95% of all music made since the 1960s is in stereo? And why would studios bother making multi-channel mixes when nobody has a rig to play it back? It's a catch-22. Well, 5% of music is still actually a lot of music, but therein lies the third problem. Most of it sucks. Not the music, the multi-channel mixes. When it's good, multi-channel can dramatically increase the sense of immersion, the size of the soundstage, and can deepen your connection with music. But when it's bad, and it often is, it's either doing almost nothing or it's doing too much. Like, oh great, there are now some whizzing noises around my head and a tuba behind my ears. So delightful, I'm really having a good time now. Right now, I think there is actually some bullishness in the industry on multi-channel. Apple Music and Tidal both have an ever-increasing library of multi-channel content, mostly in lossy Dolby formats. Although it's not the lossiness I have a problem with, it's that it's like they're getting this slew of multi-channel content with half-assed, for all I know, algorithmically generated mixes. It sounds pretty similar to Dolby Pro Logic or DTS upmixes, frankly. Very conservative in its approach. But those were the old days, and now we have entered the Age of Syn. Right off the bat, unless you have a really good digital pre-pro that costs 10 times what this thing does, I think when it comes to music, the Syn will beat almost any AVR or pre-pro as a surround upmixing preamp, at least on its analog inputs. I should mention that I did most of my testing using my Gustard R26 DAC, doing the digital conversion, or my Technics SL1210 with vinyl rather than the internal DAC. Now this is huge. For those of you who have switched from AVRs to audiophile preamps, it's not even close. All but the best mega kilobuck AVRs, in my experience, tend to sound brittle, shallow, and compressed. You're never going to get the same level of sound quality from a good, dedicated 2-channel DAC or a turntable and an analog preamp. You just won't. Full stop. Having the ability to upmix all of my favorite music and having this much control over it, all in the analog domain, is simply wondrous. In the weeks I've had the device, I found little reason to switch back to my 2-channel preamp, which is technically more hi-fi, expensive, right? And I've absolutely no inclination to listen to anything through my AVR, including my actual multi-channel content. I've listened to a ton of music with this thing, and it works wonderfully with everything I've thrown at it. It's not infrequent that I'll change up what I'm listening to and the mix will sound just a little bit off, maybe too much or too little centering, too much or too little rear channels, but a couple of tweaks on the dials and it's so natural and seamless. I feel like it could easily have been a very competent multi-channel mix. Because I have native multi-channel playback capability, I was able to compare several albums in genuine multi-channel mixes against Upmix 2-channel. In particular, I listened extensively to Nirvana's MTV Unplugged album, Bruce Springsteen live in Dublin, and Dire Straits' Brothers in Arms. Yes, my favorite multi-channel mixes are, of course, mixed better than what I can manage with the Syn. I'll also say that the Syn struggles somewhat in the imaging department. This is to be expected. It's not the Syn's fault, but just an unavoidable consequence of upmixing. Some people care a lot about having that perfect image, and others simply don't. As long as the timbre and dynamics are there, it's fine. I'll say that I'm generally in the former camp. I love good imaging. I do most of my listening in the dark and love to close my eyes and see with my mind's eye the musicians in front of me. But on the other hand, I think about what I get in exchange for a moderate hit to imaging. As much as I love multi-channel, I don't ever use Dolby Pro Logic or DTS Neo with music. It's just not worth the hit to bottleneck my precious sound quality through a lousy pre-pro or a so-so mix. But with the Syn, the entire universe of 2-channel music, digital and vinyl, is now my multi-channel library with no AVR or pre-pro in the chain. Is that a good trade-off? You bet it is. When it comes to music, I can recommend the Syn absolutely. Multi-channel, all the things. But be careful because you may never want to listen to 2-channel again. Okay, let's talk cinema. Cinema is by far the dominant use case for multi-channel. These days, most every major streaming service offers a substantial amount of content in 5.1 or Atmos. If you're wise enough to still use Blu-ray discs, they almost always have surround sound in some format. Yet, it's still somewhat uncommon for people to have a real 5.1 or greater speaker configuration. Wiring up an open concept living room with speakers is expensive and messy. Wife approval factor? Out of the window. Thus, it's more common these days for people to use multi-channel capable soundbars that can be fairly intelligent with taking advantage of directionality and reflections to create a surround-like experience. But importantly, I think this means that studios feel they can get by with pretty bare-bones surround mixes and cinematic content. Even the recent cinematic blockbuster Top Gun Maverick, they really only brought out the real whiz-bang Atmos mastery for the big airplanes go burr, shooty shoot, pew pew scenes. Most of the time in cinema, there is a crucially important center channel for dialogue, your left and right pan, and then some sparse atmospherics in the rears, and that's about it. In my testing, the Syn does a pretty bang-up job with movies and shows. I was genuinely surprised how much I enjoyed the final death mission scene in Top Gun Maverick, which I watched like over 9,000 times in every different way for this review. No, it's not quite as good as the Atmos mix on the Blu-ray, but it was still totally satisfying. I still felt immersed in the cinematic experience, and probably nearly to the same extent. There were airplanes whooshing all around my head, lots of rumbly explosions. I was there in the cockpit with Maverick hearing all this don't think, do waxing. He was right there in front of me, well positioned on the center channel. It was a coherent left to right, front to back soundscape. His signature buzzing of the tower was dope as ever. But the best part, I can get all of this out of the optical from my TV and into an audiophile DAC, which, even with lossy streaming content, can still sound fantastic. So, can the Syn be at the center of your home theater system? Yeah, I actually think it can. In this case, it's, in my opinion, not clearly the better option over an AVR or pre-pro as it is with music. There's obviously a lot higher proportion of native multi-channel content with cinema than there is with music that you would perhaps want to take advantage of. And with cinema, the primacy of pure, uncut, unadulterated sound quality isn't as important for most people, even audiophiles. So I'll say that the Syn would be sort of a strange choice to make over an AVR if you weren't also going to use it with music in a serious way, but it's still surprisingly viable. Thus, I can absolutely recommend the Syn as the heart of a home theater system to somebody who intends also to do some upmixing with two-channel music. It will completely handle your multi-channel cinema experience, albeit probably not quite at the same level as a real digital pre-pro with all of its fancy multi-channel codecs, but still totally viable. Alright, now let's talk about gaming. Schiit has made some effort to market this thing as a gadget for gamers. The device has a mic input and therefore also an ADC. There's not like a ton of expense in that, but it's there. The headphone amplifier, I suspect, was also included for this reason. So, should gamers buy this device? Well, my answer is a bit more conditional. It's going to depend on what sort of games you play and how you play them. The Syn was an absolute joy to use with my Nintendo Switch. The Nintendo Switch doesn't have multi-channel capabilities to begin with, so it's either the Syn or digital upmixing with an AVR. And here I found the ability to customize my surround mix useful. In Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, I dialed up the rear channels pretty hard. Hearing all the tall grasses rustle around me on an open field enhanced my sense of immersion in the game. I enjoyed the environmental sound effects in caves and such, random animal noises, wind, and weather. There aren't like super detailed spatial cues embedded in Zelda, but what was there rendered just fine. I knew when someone was behind me, to the left, to the right, in front of me, etc. And this is pretty much the story with any game I played where spatial cues aren't mission critical. It was delightful to run through my Switch and Steam libraries. God games and RTS games like Civilization, SimCity, and StarCraft are all great. These games don't have super sophisticated 3D engines and rarely have multi-channel capabilities. I'd recommend the Syn all day, every day for general gaming. On that note, this is where I want to transition into a discussion about the headphone use case, and I'm going to continue with gaming. Most PC gamers play with headphones, right? That's only 2 channels, so what does it matter if Overwatch 2 can render exquisite 3D sound environments over umpteen channel Atmos? Well, the thing is that there are numerous ways those umpteen channels can be specially downmixed for headphones, preserving and embedding all of those spatial cues. Remember, all sound is ultimately 2-channel because we have but the 2 ears. Overwatch 2 has Dolby Atmos for headphones built in. For games that don't, there are numerous software or hardware approaches to achieving this that do a passable job. Generally speaking, there was no headphone use case where the Syn really seemed to enhance my experience. Not on PC, not on Switch. Remember that with headphones, the Syn only has 2 axes of control, crossfeed and presence, neither of which have particular benefits for gaming, at least for me. Similarly, I didn't find the Syn to be especially pleasing with music over headphones. The presence style was sometimes enjoyable to tinker with, enabling me to add a bit of emphasis on vocals where I felt the inclination. I mentioned the Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers live at the Fillmore collection. It was a nice touch. Chantel Chamberlain's breathtaking album Temptation was another one. Her voice isn't even recessed at all, but she sounds so tempting that I just had to bring her in closer. It was cool. I didn't find the crossfeed dial, however, to be very useful with music. No matter which way you turn it, it compromises imaging and the arrangement by pulling everything apart or smashing it together. Some light touch negative crossfeed can somewhat increase the sense of soundstage width, while dialing up the presence can compensate for the loss of vocals emphasis, but the effect is pretty minimal and comes at a price that isn't worth the squeeze. In order for the crossfeed effect to work, a bit of delay must be added to the cross channel. The human brain will readily pick up on it and use that information to start filling out a forward dimension. But without it, crossfeed just pushes everything to the middle of your head. The domain where I actually did find the Syn to be useful with headphones, however, was cinema. Unlike video games and music, cinema generally doesn't render well on headphones. Cinema is typically meant to be viewed on a screen in a room with some kind of speaker system. a soundbar, or at least the TV's internal speakers. I find that with cinema, you often get a kind of split image that is the consequence of a stereophonic field that didn't quite render properly because the left ear doesn't hear what the right ear does, and so forth. And the effect is much worse with cinema than with music. Again, without a bit of delay added to the positive crossfeed, the effect isn't beneficial to headphones. But I did find that a bit of negative crossfeed seemed to widen the soundstage or head stage a bit. But more importantly, a bit of presence boost seemed to help consolidate voices in the center a bit better. For a lot of dialogue-rich movies and shows, I found this to be a good trade. Perfect imaging is inherently less important with cinema than with music, but you do want to have some sense of space and a clearly rendered center dialogue. So yeah, I think the Syn can enhance cinema over headphones. This, I think, is true. The thing is, however, that there are already some pretty good tools for doing this in more sophisticated ways. The same hardware and software tools like Creative's Super X-Fi system, Redscape, and other systems do a pretty good job of virtualizing spatial audio, both multi-channel and stereo for headphones. Apple's AirPods and AirPod Max do this natively with head tracking. Accordingly, I even have a tough time recommending the Syn for headphone cinephiles. There are simply better tools that do it cheaper. In sum, the Syn easily exceeded my expectations with a 5.1 speaker configuration in all three application areas. With music, it's an easy recommendation. For what you possibly give up, that is a handful of actually good multi-channel mixes, you get so much more. And it still works really well with cinema, even if it isn't true native 5.1, to the point where most of the time, for most people, the difference isn't going to matter much. And it's the same for video games. True, it won't replace a 5.1 rig in all gaming use cases, but for many it will do swimmingly, perhaps even better than an AVR or Pre-Pro. I adored the Syn with my Switch, which doesn't even do any sort of multi-channel at all. Seriously, it's me, Mario. Never sounded so good. Zelda? Fantastic. God games like Civ or StarCraft? Greatly improved immersion and enjoyment. But with headphones? Well, it's just hard for me to see a use case where it's really a good investment. Despite my feelings about the headphone use case, I really don't want to criticize this device. I think this device is awesome, and I really hope Schiit sells a metric F-ton of these. I think people who have the opportunity to try one on a 5.1 rig are going to have a great time. And I would absolutely recommend it at the heart of an entry-level or even mid-fi multi-channel speaker system. I'll say it is a bit awkward for those of you who already have a 5.1 system, since you sort of have to dump your AVR or Pre-Pro, which you presumably already have. Actually, I think it might be helpful if Schiit offered a simple 2x6 channel switcher box or something that allowed the Syn to coexist with somebody's existing Pre-Pro a bit more easily. For those of you who don't already have a 5.1 rig, I'd say you can skip the AVR altogether, especially at the entry level. Put that money into 5 active speakers and a sub, and you're donezo. Or even better, pick up a decent multi-channel amplifier and some passives. That being said, I do have a couple of quibbles. First, I think it needs an adjustable LFE or sub-channel dial. My understanding is that early prototypes had one, but Schiit decided that it wasn't necessary since most active subwoofers have a built-in volume control. Schiit made, I think, an incorrect assumption that once dialed in, people will tend to leave it where it is. But that's in part because it's way over there in the corner on the back of a sub against a wall, and it all typically gets tuned by the AVR or Pre-Pro anyways, and you don't want to mess with that. Depending on what I was listening to, I found myself wanting to tune this often. Perhaps removing the sub-channel dial was necessary to meet the price target of $399 and I get that. Second, I'd like to see at least one more axis of control on the headphone output. If there was a way to add just very small increments of delay to the crossfeed, you could push the image forward so listeners would get a little bit more of a out-of-head headphone experience. With a bit more trickery, it also might be possible to do a full 5.1 headphone virtualization by taking the extracted rear channels, shaping them with an adjustable dial corresponding to the effect of ear shape. and then adding them back to the left and right channels. In digital solutions, there is often a parameter for ear shape and size, which could perhaps be implemented in analog as well. The delay time is essentially head width, a second parameter. Yes, this would all increase the cost and complexity of the device, but it's what I think is necessary to make this thing viable for headphones. If the economics of that don't look good, I suggest just removing the headphone features and focusing the device on speaker systems. So would I buy this device? Well, I'll be lying if I'm not struggling to send this thing back. I love the concept. I can't believe this is the only one of these things out there. The Syn really reminds me of what I have always liked about Schiit Audio. They try stuff. Think of all the surprising, quirky products they've come out with over the years. They aren't all successful, but they did something new and put it out there. I understand that the marketplace may be confused initially about what this thing is. If you don't understand a thing, how can you anticipate whether or not you'd like it? Well, I think if people have an opportunity to use one of these, they're going to love it. Between you and me, yeah, I'm probably going to keep this thing. It's going to be too hard for me to go back to my life before my own custom multi-channel mixes of all the two-channel content everywhere. But what I really want is, the big version of this thing. You know how Schiit Audio always does like the small, medium, and large, and occasionally extra large version of everything? Well, I want the fully loaded Freya-sized version of this with Schiit's more advanced gain stages, switched relay attenuators, beefy power supply, and general hi-fi refinements, as well as at least one more set of analog inputs. Like, come on, I gotta plug my DAC and at least my turntable into this thing. I can't keep switching the RCAs like a pleb. And that's just it. At least for me, a cinephile and audiophile, I don't see this as replacing my digital pre-pro. Rather, I see it as replacing my stereo preamplifier. And it does a respectable job in that regard as a preamplifier. And it will be fine for most entry-level and mid-fi systems. But when you start getting up to the higher-end stuff, it will present a significant bottleneck in terms of raw sound quality. Personally, I would be ready to shell out $1,000 or even more for the higher-end hi-fi version of this that would give me the extreme level of performance I like to see at the center of an audiophile listening room. But yeah, until then, I guess I'm going to be a sinner. Thank you for watching.